Hi folks, welcome to November's Ag Science Cafe event. I'm really excited to introduce y'all to Ford Evans. Ford is actually on our DIVE4Ag team, and I've learned so much from Ford already, so I'm really excited for your presentation. I'll pass the mic to you.
All right, thank you, Kristen. Yes, my name is Ford Evans. I am currently a researcher with the Coastal Oregon Marine Experiment Station at Hatfield Marine Science Center in Newport, Oregon. It's part of Oregon State University. I actually work with a couple different species, particularly focusing on the aquaculture aspects of these species, and one that I'm working with are oysters. So this presentation is going to focus on oyster farming, particularly in Oregon. So I guess to start off, a good question is, what are oysters? Oysters are bivalves. That means two shells. And in this case, the way this oyster is oriented, you can see this top shell is fairly flat. This is a second shell down here, and that is its cupped side. So when you go out and if you've eaten oysters on the half shell, it's usually presented in this cup half of the shell. They are mollusks, and that means that they're related to not only things like clams, but also snails are also mollusks. And market size depends on actually what the demand is. Some eaters like very large ones, others like very small, but typically it's about a 3 to 4 inch animal. Now in the wild, and as we culture them, they are filter feeders. So this means they filter a lot of water, up to 50 gallons a day, that they can pass through their bodies. And they filter out algae, and that is what they end up eating, and that's where they get their nutrition. They have developed, their feeding organism is actually their gills, and they also use that, of course, as their respiratory organ underwater. But the gills also serve an important function of filtering food. So as they filter the seawater, they're getting nutritious things like microalgae, phytoplankton, but they're also getting other things like silt and so forth that is not a food item, not digestible. And their gills have adapted to separate those two items. For example, they can shunt nutritious things towards their mouth to be consumed, and they can reject things that aren't nutritious and that they don't want to consume. They are sessile animals, and that means that they actually have about a 2 or 3 week free-swimming larval period at the beginning of their lives, but then they metamorphose into their adult form. And when they do that, they cement themselves to the substrate, and they are forever there for the rest of their lives. And in the case of in the wild, this can be dozens of years. In the case of culture systems, it's typically 2 years to reach market size. But they're sessile animals, and one of their favorite places to cement themselves to set on, are other oyster shells. So you do find aggregations of oysters, particularly in native oyster beds, like on the East Coast, for example, here. And they essentially attract more oysters to these reefs just by having nice oyster shell substrate for free-swimming larvae to attach to. So they're reef builders. So in terms of environmental services, ecosystem services, oysters are fantastic, and they're sometimes referred to as ecosystem engineers. They can build these large reefs, but also their filter feeding behavior literally filters the water, takes nutrients out of the water, and either turns it into tissue or can excrete it as waste, which then gets incorporated into the sediment. But nonetheless, it serves an important role of pulling nutrients out of the water. So oysters, from an aquaculture standpoint, are raised primarily for human consumption, and they come in a variety of forms in the marketplace. The simplest on the left here are just single oysters. So these are live animals. What will happen is the consumer will purchase a bag of a dozen or so animals. They'll take it home or wherever, shuck them, barbecue them, eat them, however they want to cook them up. But these are live animals that they will end up shucking. When I say shuck, I mean open them up, separate the shells. And this is typically done with a shucking knife. We're going to see a photo of that a little bit later. In some cases, farms will do the shucking for you and sell just the meats, in this case, a pint or so, 16 ounces, I guess, of oyster meat. And interesting, when we say oyster meat, it's actually the entire body that you end up eating when you have oysters on the half shell or raw oyster meats. There are also value-added products, so some degree of processing going in this case on the right, smoked oyster meats in cans. Sometimes you see them in sort of the vacuum packed packages and so forth. But if you go to a restaurant, you're typically going to find oysters sold on the half shell. So this is the deep half of the cup. The oyster meat is presented in it. They usually try to make it look presentable. And it can be cooked in some cases and with some recipes. But more times than not, you're going to find them raw on the half shell. And just as an interesting little tidbit, oysters, to the best of my knowledge, are one of the few animals here in the US that we end up eating live. Can't say that about too many other animals that I can think of. So farming oysters on the West Coast requires that you have an understanding of their life cycle. And in particular, we're talking about the Pacific oyster here. And what happens in nature is they are broadcast spawners. So eggs and sperm will be released into the water column. The eggs will be fertilized. And then they go through, as I mentioned, this 2 to 3 week free swimming larval period here. This is a picture of a veliger larvae. It actually does have 2 shells. It's tough to see. But what you do see here is the velum, and this is a ring of cilia that helps it swim. As it ages, getting more towards the 2 to 3 week old age, they also develop a foot that comes out. And this is referred to as the petty veliger larvae, petty referring to foot in this case. And when this happens, you know that the animals are ready to set onto some hard substrate and metamorphose into their adult form. So typically what happens with oyster farms is the farmer will present an ideal situation for this to happen, which I'll show you on the next slide. But once setting occurs, what you have here is the start of sort of the grow out phase of production. Here we have small oysters that have cemented themselves onto an oyster shell. They're beginning to grow, and they're just like little tiny adult oysters, except they're very small. And at this point, we refer to them as spat. And they're just going to keep growing, laying down more shell, laying down more tissue, until they grow up into large adult size oysters and would be visibly recognizable to us as adult oysters. So there's really 2 phases that are happening here. One is this larval phase, and that happens in hatcheries, in oyster hatcheries. And then there is a sort of grow out phase where you take them once they've set on shell, take them until they grow until their adult form. So this is the grow out phase. So in some cases, this is done, a single farm can handle all of that. But what I'm going to focus on here in Oregon are 2 separate farms. And these will be highlighted so that we can cover the entire oyster life cycle. The first one is Whiskey Creek Shellfish Hatchery, and this is up in Netarts Bay, which is on the Oregon coast here, very close to Tillamook Bay up here. It produces about 1 billion oyster larvae per year. And the second farm is Oregon Oyster Farm. This is actually located in Yaquina Bay here, just outside of Newport. And they produce about a little over 1 million adult oysters per year. What ends up happening is Whiskey Creek is in the business of producing larvae. They'll sell larvae to anyone, typically to other farmers, not just Oregon Oyster Farm, but any farmer who's interested in taking larvae, setting them on shell, and then growing them out to market size. Oregon Oyster Farm doesn't want to deal with the larval phase. There's a lot involved with that. They'd rather just purchase the larvae, set them on shell themselves, and then grow them out from there. And I'll talk about each one of these farms in the next couple slides. So we'll start off with Whiskey Creek Shellfish Hatchery. Now they are located on Netarts Bay, right across the road from Netarts Bay. However, they still need to filter the water that comes in from Netarts Bay. This is primarily to get rid of solids, sediment. There could be other larvae that are from other species that come in with the water. You want to filter all that stuff out. They also want to be prepared to treat the water if needed in case the water is acidic. If it has a low pH, they can adjust for that. Also, there are times when water can have very low dissolved oxygen levels, and they can adjust for that as well. So they want to treat the water, get in the best condition possible before they use it to raise oyster larvae in. And they are a large commercial operation. They have many of these 20,000 liter larval tanks. Here's a picture of some more larvae. You can imagine these are, let's say, 200 to 300 microns. So that's, a quarter of a millimeter in length. These tanks are filled with these larvae. The tanks are providing optimal growing environment, so good, nice warm water. Here's an air line going in to keep the oxygen level high and keep the water moving a little bit, mixed. But they also provide food for the larvae. Now at this stage, they are also filter feeders, so they rely on filtering algae, just like the adults do, out of the water column. So actually a large fraction of the work that is being done at Whiskey Creek Shellfish Hatchery is actually growing the algae that they use to feed the larvae. So they have many tanks that are dedicated solely to growing algae. In this case, it's just microalgae, single-celled algae, or what you might think of as phytoplankton. So they provide light, they provide nutrients, keep the temperatures just right, and so forth to get the optimum algal growth, which they then feed to the larvae. So this is a video that we actually just got from some folks up at Whiskey Creek. And what it is, it's showing, this is actually a cone that's going through a table. That's not important at this point, but what's going to happen is this video is going to zoom in on larvae, millions and millions of larvae that are swimming in this what looks to be a cup of water. We're going to zoom in. You're going to see some some swimming behavior of the larvae, which is vertical. They'll swim up and then they'll sort of fall down. They'll swim up and fall down. So one way that Whiskey Creek knows when to sell larvae to, let's say, Oregon Oyster Farm, is when they reach a certain size. They can look at them and they can see is that foot there, the pedivelager, is that foot there indicating that it's ready to set. There's also swimming behavior, which indicates that they are getting ready to set. So I'm going to hit play here. Hopefully this will work. Yeah, so we zoom in a little bit. It's a little bit shaky, but all these dots that you see in here, and it'll go out of focus, but back in here in a second. All the dots that you see in there are oyster larvae swimming. So these are pedivelager larvae. They still have the velum, so they're still able to swim. They also have the foot, so they're looking for something to set to, but they'll swim up to the surface and then fall back down to the bottom. So there's this vertical swimming behavior that's going on here. And that's good for two reasons. One, it allows the animal, the oyster larvae, to bounce off the bottom, essentially. It can sense when and allow it to assess the substrate. Is it over suitable substrate for it to set on and spend the rest of its life there? If not, it can swim back up into the water column and be dispersed and swept perhaps to a better environment. So anyways, that was a neat video that we got just the other day that I thought I'd share. It gives you a sense that these animals are living things and they're swimming about even if you can't see them in these giant tanks. When they harvest these large tanks, these 20,000 liter tanks, they'll actually drain the tank onto very fine mesh sieves. So this is a 100 micron sieve that the water is being passed through. But all this stuff that looks sort of like sand here, this is actually the oyster larvae that are being retained on this mesh sieve. Alan Barton here, the manager at Whiskey Creek Shellfish Hatchery, will then rinse those animals into one of those cones that we had that video of. And then he can use that cone to quantify and package the larvae for sale to grow out farms such as Oregon Oyster Farm. Now, in this case, you can see the oyster larvae actually have stopped swimming and settled down to the cone. And he can then dispense a known volume that he can translate into number of larvae. And this pile here is essentially a concentrate of 100% oyster larvae. And it comes out really as a, more like the consistency of like a slushy or something like that. It comes out here, he dispenses a known volume, so he has an idea of how many larvae are there, and that's to fill orders and so forth for the farms. These, they're then bound up in what is essentially cheesecloth or very fine mesh material. They're packaged up in these little pouches, dropped into an insulated box, and then sent overnight to whichever farm it was that placed this order. In this case, he's shipping off, it was probably a quantity like this, 11 million individual oyster larvae are being sent off. So you can send a lot of animals in a very small box. And that's actually a good way to do it. They'll get sent overnight to the farm, to the grow out farm. And here's where we move from Whiskey Creek. Now we're moving to Oregon Oyster Farm. And what we have here is Lucien. He's the owner of Oregon Oyster Farm. He just received his little pouch of oyster larvae here. There's about 4 million oysters here. He received it in this insulated box. And these are all going to be Pediveliger larvae. Here's the larvae with its foot coming out. So these animals are really looking for some place to settle, someplace to set to spend the rest of their life. So what Lucien has done before the oyster larvae arrived is he does have what's known as culch. This is essentially cleaned oyster shell on the upper left here. He will take that oyster shell, put it into a setting tank, and this is a tank that has nice warm water in it, a lot of air bubbles, so that mixes the water very well. He'll then add the Pediveliger larvae that he received from the hatchery in here, and just in a matter of days, again, these are animals that are really looking for something good to settle on. Lucien has provided a lot of good substrate for them to settle on, and in a couple of days, you get those oyster larvae to cement themselves onto the shell, and then metamorphose into tiny versions of the adult form. At this point, we refer to them as oyster spat. So these are spat on culch here. This oyster shell is referred to as culch. And now they are ready to be raised as their adult form. There's a couple of ways that Lucien will do this at Oregon Oyster Farm. We'll talk about two of them. The first is off-bottom culture. Here's a picture. This is actually a piece of culch with the larvae. You can see they're really beginning to grow and begin to look like oysters, little tiny oysters here. This is probably a couple months old, actually. So it's a little bit older than the culch that we saw in the previous slide. But what he'll do is he'll take these pieces of shell that have oyster spat on them, string them into polypropylene line every foot or so, and then drape that line over these cross members on these rafts. And he's got a series of rafts that are actually in Yaquina Bay. So these animals are now suspended in the water column. They're not touching the bottom. They have lots of water all around them. It's keeping temperature nice. It's providing lots of food. You come back in about 2 years. This is the simplified version. You come back in 2 years, and now you have what once was these pieces of shell with tiny animals on them. Now you have the pieces of shell with full-grown adults on them. So they're really basketball-sized clusters of adult oysters. And what will happen next is these animals will then be taken to, up here in the top left, there's a pier where he has a processing facility. They'll be cleaned and the clusters will be broken apart and sorted. And we'll talk a little bit about that later as well. But that's the process of off-bottom culture that they use at Oregon Oyster Farm, employing these rafts and spat on culch intertwined in the polypropylene line. It's actually a pretty interesting system. There is another approach that they take, and this is referred to as on-bottom culture. And in this case, it's all about getting the culch that has the spat on it just to the bottom of the seafloor. where just like a regular oyster reef, the animals will grow, capitalizing on whatever food is in the water, assuming the temperature is okay and everything like that. Should be a good environment. What will end up happening is, again, the folks at Oregon Oyster Farm will come by. In this case, they use a boat with a dredge. They'll dredge the bottom, scoop up the oysters for a couple of years, deposit them in these containers, take these back to the processing pier, and then again process them to be sold. In this case, this is on bottom and it's subtidal, so that all of this is happening in relatively deep water, and all below the tidal, the low tide mark. So everything is what's called subtidal here. On-bottom culture is actually quite common throughout the Pacific Northwest. And in this case, in Tillamook Bay, it's actually occurring in intertidal lands. So here the tide goes out, you have this exposed tidal flat. And here the farmer will take out the spat, the culch that has spat attached to it, scatter it over this plot here, come back in a couple of years, and then pick out the animals that look like they're good for market, load them up into these totes that they have here. These have floats attached to them. So actually what will end up happening is at high tide, a boat will come by and collect all these baskets and again, take them to land to be processed. So two different approaches. Not everyone has deep water where you can have a subtidal environment to do this. Sometimes it's all about intertidal areas, and this is quite common, for example, in Tillamook Bay, Willapa Bay, other coastal bays, this is quite common. So back to specifically Oregon Oyster Farm, this is a photo of the beginning of the processing pier. Oysters in their clusters and whatnot will be brought into the processing pier where the clusters will be broken apart. The animals will be cleaned, sorted both by size and by quality. If the animals look to be in good shape and are presentable, as it were, they can be sold as singles. So these are animals that are destined for restaurants and to be sold as oysters on the half shell. So it has to be a somewhat attractive product. The shell has to be in good shape. And then these are packaged up and sent to restaurants. Another direction the oysters can take is they get shucked. And in this case, there is a shucker who has his shucking knife, will open up oysters, and then basically scrape out the meat. They'll collect the meat, clean the animals here, the meats. They can also sort them by size at this point. So these are two different paths they go. The shucking is a very interesting operation. In fact, their team can shuck 5,000 to 7,000 oysters per day. So these people get very proficient at shucking animals. They're very fast at it. So there's also the retail aspect of Oregon Oyster Farm. They actually have a storefront where they sell product. Not only do they ship product out to restaurants, but they can also sell stuff right there on the Bay Road and on Yaquina Bay. What's interesting to see is they can price it based on a few things. Primarily size is an interesting, maybe let me back up and say, here's fresh oyster meat, fresh oyster in the shell. So these are their two primary modes of sales. It looks like they do have some smoked oysters, and then shooters might come with a sauce. I'm not entirely sure, but primarily they're selling oyster meat and oyster in the shell. And again, as I was saying, they are priced by size primarily. Interesting, extra large oysters you need to pre-order and prepay. These are animals that they likely have to go to a special oyster bed to collect from. So I think they want to know beforehand if you're interested in the particularly large animals, which aren't very commonly purchased here in the US. However, in Asia, it is there's a much higher demand for larger size animals. In the US, it's the smaller ones. In fact, a particularly smaller kind is the Kumamoto, and this is a smaller oyster with a very deep cup. So this is very appealing for the half shell market. Native oyster, and so this is not Pacific, the Pacific oyster that I've been talking about. This is one that actually sets on its own here in Yaquina Bay, and they do sell those as well. One other thing I'll just mention is that OSU, well, terrestrial plant and animal agriculture has actually been conducting selective breeding for thousands of years. With aquaculture, it's a much younger industry. There hasn't actually been too much selective breeding, though a lot of people are beginning to head that way as the industry matures, as aquaculture growing animals and in the aquatic environment. And in the case of oysters, there was actually a breeding program that was started in 1995, and it was targeting, actually still exists, so it continues to target high yield, so trying to get fast growing oysters that are high surviving. And more recently, they're beginning to focus on specific oyster disease, developing a resistance to specific diseases. And it's interesting, the breeding program has to account for, these aren't, you can't pick out an individual here, for example, and put an ear tag on it or anything like that. What you have to do is develop families, create families, and then grow them separately in separate culture units. And then what happens is, as you evaluate them on a family basis. So which families were the highest yielding, which families had the highest tolerance to disease and these types of things. And then you pick parents for the next generation from those high performing families and continue on that way. So this is a program that's underway at here at Hatfield Marine Science Center in Newport. And actually, it's been very popular and well received by the by industry. So I'm going to wrap it up there. Thank you very much for your attention.